So next we're going to talk about the Lionel Train Company, toy train company. And we have this example here of a locomotive, which, I know some of you are probably screaming at me right now because we'll talk a bit about how this one's a bit of a fraud in a minute. So Lionel is one of the most recognizable names in the world of scale model trains. It was founded by Joshua Lionel Cohen in 1900. He was about 23 years old and a university dropout, working after hours in the Acme Electric Lamp Factory when he was experimenting for a fuse to ignite magnesium powder in the hopes of creating something helpful for photographers. And the U.S. Navy actually contacted him to make fuses for exploding mines. So he used the money from that contract to open a shop in New York called the Lionel Manufacturing Company to make more fuses, motors, electric novelties, and he patented also a dry cell battery. In 1901, he made an animated display for a shop, which was a cigar box on wheels that went around and around a track, and it proved so popular that he started to make toy trains. The first track that he made was just a 2-rail system, where, as you know, I said earlier, most tracks today have the 3 rails, and this first set was called the Electric Express. So all early cars and engines had only 4 wheels, and the engine was steel. Most other parts were made from cast iron, while boxcars were made from a combination of cast iron and sheet metal. Hobbyists began to create a demand for small-scale versions of real trains, the demographic to which Lionel caters to the present day. And in 1905, Cohen hired someone to run the manufacturing side of things, while he took over the marketing, which he absolutely excelled at. He created the first catalog for electric trains, which actually printed the trains in color and showed children and their parents playing with them. And in 1906, he changed to a 3-rail track, and he called it the standard gauge, as I mentioned earlier. So the center rail carried an electric current to the train and eliminated short circuits. In 1906, he introduced passenger cars, tanker cars, a coal car, a cattle car, an observation car, and a caboose in 1909. The cars were made from soldered sheet metal, painted often with enamel, and would have kind of stripes and lettering applied by hand. Other manufacturers started using Lionel's made-up gauge, giving it legitimacy. And while you could run other manufacturers' trains on a Lionel track, the couplers were incompatible, so you could not often mix and match train sets. So since homes increasingly had electricity, the trains did not have to be powered by batteries anymore. Cohen actually created a transformer to reduce electrical current to be safely used within the trains. In 1909, new additions included a caboose, a steam engine with electric headlamps. And 1915, he had 17 train sets in a catalog and a standard gauge, and he introduced 9 sets of the O gauge, which is a smaller gauge, to compete with Ives trains. And early couplers were used in a hook and eyelet style, but in 1923 they introduced a combination style with a latching mechanism to be able to run old and new cars together. In 1924 they switched to the latch style only, which I believe is what's on this particular toy. In 1917, in correspondence with the start of World War I, they made an O-gauge military train. Locomotives had the locomotive for this train had 2 cannons on the top and was very popular, even though it was only produced for 1 year. The 1920s Lionels are considered the classic Lionels, and they were extremely detailed and highly authentic kind of train models. So that is what our locomotive here is inspired by. And we also have the passenger car and observation car, which I'll show you in a moment. These sets have actually been highly sought after by collectors ever since the 1920s. 1940 was the last year for standard gauge in favor of smaller gauges such as O gauge because of the Great Depression. And O gauge was a lot cheaper to manufacture, and it took up less space in the house when laid out. In 1933, Lionel Jr. was launched as a cheaper line. So during World War II, Lionel stopped train production to manufacture compasses for the government. They also did a full paper train set that included O-gauge cardboard track and engine and a caboose, because metal was reserved for the war effort at this time. And some kids actually donated their Lionel trains to scrap metal drives, and they were able to buy a wood pull train instead. So Post-war, Lionel made steam engines that actually emitted real smoke, which was the product of an ammonium nitrate pellet that would be placed in a dimple in the train's headlight to produce nitrogen oxide, which sounds very dangerous. In 1948, Lionel began producing diesel engines and also began using plastic to make trains for the first time. So from 1940 to 1955, Lionel offered trains ranging anywhere from $16 up to $200. By 1953, Lionel was one of the largest toy manufacturers in the world. In 1957, they produced a girls' train that had a pink locomotive with pastel boxcars. This is inspired by this particular locomotive that we're looking at here is inspired by the number 33 Lionel supermotor version of the 33 locomotive. So it would have likely said New York Central Lines on the side here, and it dates to about 1923 to 1924. So the cars with this engine are here. Are not the same cars that were released with the original Pullman and observation car. They would have had more rounded windows. I believe that these are the number 332 mail car, so that's this one here, which dates to 1925 to 1929, and the number 341 observation car, which dates from 1925 to 1929. So this engine or locomotive is not the original body, and we were looking at it, and it's in really pristine condition, but it's very, very heavy. I believe that the bottom, you can see on the bottom here, this is probably the original base for the locomotive, but it was probably very damaged, and somebody decided to use their sheet metal skills to reproduce it. So if you look it up, the number, I believe I said number 33, right? The super motor version of the 33 locomotive. It's very, very similar, but there are a few things that are slightly off. So I do appreciate the passion that someone put into this. But it's not the original Lionel from, the 20s. And then these, of course, are beautiful. So as I was saying earlier, this is an example of a Pullman car, so you can see a little bit more of the luxury of this particular piece. And this is the railway observation car, and the doors slide. These have been refinished, so they're covered in fresh paint, and they would have also probably said something where this little bit of gold is here, right at the bottom. So yeah, there is our Lionel train. Next up, we're going to talk again about Marx, because he was one of the greatest toy manufacturers in the world. And in 1934, he began producing trains after purchasing Joy Line trains from the Girard Company. And Marx had been a sales representative for Girard trains prior to their bankruptcy during the Great Depression. He began initially re-releasing the Joy Line trains in the Marx boxes, and these were simple tin plate lithographed O-gauge trains with 4 wheels. So they used lighter sheets of tin plate, and it would all be formed together with tabs, and this resulted in a sturdier, longer lasting toy. The following year, Marx released his own line of trains using the same process. Their electric trains featured an open AC motor, which cost less but were still quite reliable. The wheels were larger also, and known as fat wheels, were not able to run on other competitors' tracks or switches. As we referred to in a previous Heritage Live, Marx faced some competition from Unique Art Manufacturing, who attempted to release similar trains. They were 7.5 inches long, while Marx trains were only 6 inches, and Marx met this threat by releasing a 7-inch train in bright colors, and eventually Unique Art gave up as they could no longer compete, and they went out of business. In 1952, Marx transitioned to plastic instead of stamped tin and steel, and the train cars were initially unmarked and came with decals that could be added by the consumer in their own pattern. In 1952, Marx transitioned to plastic instead of stamped tin and steel. The train cars were initially unmarked and came with decals that could be added by the consumer in their own pattern. Marx bought Hafner Trains tooling from Wyandotte Toys in 1956. And Louis Marx purchased the tooling and sent it to its subsidiary in Mexico, where it produced inexpensive wind-up battery-powered sets. Many believe the only reason why Marx purchased the tooling was to reduce competition within the marketplace. He didn't want someone else purchasing it and offering him greater competition. Another megalomaniac. These toys were at the lower end of the market, and they were often clockwork and tin lithographed. Hafner was one of the only companies to never produce an electric train. A common practice today is to outfit a Hafner locomotive with a surplus Marx electric motor, and Hafner and Marx often used recycled lithography, so in order to save on the costs. So there are actually Marx tin plate trains out there that have another pattern on the inside, as they were made for something that, you know, didn't work out the first time. So Marx used the Hafner factories to produce cheap clockwork trains, and they now hit 3 markers with their trains. So they had trains for young children, colorful trains for older children, and deluxe editions for hobbyists. The more involved line included more detailed rolling stock and better diesel engines. In 1957, Marx put out a line of HO scale model trains, which were very successful. And in 1972, Marx sold to Quaker, who sold to the British toy company Dunby Comex Marx in 1976, and everything was actually liquidated in 1980. So that's why they're not really around today. So this example here is a wind-up locomotive with a cattle car, and I believe, yep, this actually slides back and forth. There's a side dumping car and then a caboose, and this dates from anywhere from 1948 to 1970. It is wind-up O-scale, and it is the Marx 591 steamer locomotive, which dates from about 1953 to 1960, and then this would have been sold as a separate set. So they came in different electric motors, battery powered or wind-up. So this is the wind-up version, and this is the electric version. So they are pretty much identical, except this one's in a little bit rougher shape because it's a bit older and it was probably played with more. And, you know, this one has this piece at the bottom which would connect to the track and be able to get the electrical current, whereas this one has a clockwork mechanism on the bottom. So there we go. Very exciting. There's our first Marx train, and then I'll show you another electrified version. So you may remember this guy from the beginning of our talk, and this comes with a tender. So when I was talking about a tender earlier, that's what this car is, and this one is actually made to look like it's carrying some coal. And it also has this liquid carrier, and then this one. Oh, and here's an example of the different couplings. So we have a combination here of the hook and eye type, and then there's the rounded type. So this is a bit of a Franken set. Can you see all of it? I guess you can't. There. Now you can kind of see the poor little caboose at the end. There, maybe I'll. There. If I do that, then you can see it all. It's quite a long train. So this dates to about 1954. This set, and this is called a hopper. Sorry. So it includes the tender, the liquid carrier, the hopper, and the caboose. And apparently the steamer locomotive is known as the Marx 400, which actually produced smoke as well out of the smokestack using a mixture, a special chemical mixture. And I saw online that you'd like buy a little package and put it in there. Apparently there was only a very small run of this set made in 1954. And yeah. Or of the locomotive that produced the steam, and then the rest of the set was actually sold between 1953 and 1970, which likely explains why, you know, the couplings on the tender and locomotive are quite different from the couplings on the cars themselves. So these are kind of plastic and are, you know, cheaper probably than the metal that would have been used on that. So the other thing I wanted to show you was these two lovely signals here. So I did mention that, you know, these sets came with signals as well, and This one is just a light, so you would, there's some electric, conduits here, so you would connect your train set to the conduits. If you can, yeah, you can see that. They can see it in the photo, it's fine. But this one is really exciting. It's got this little switch here at the top, and this would allow you to run 2 train sets on the same track. And what you could do is, depending whether this was up or down, you would be able to stop the electricity going to one train set versus the other. So they would go kind of like around and really fast. And I'll see if we can maybe include the link so you can see it in action. It's quite exciting. I didn't realize that, these trains went that fast. So these date from about 1935 to about 1945. So they're a bit older than the last train set that I showed you. And so there's our Marks sets. Let's get them off to the side. So we're going to continue talking more about other post-war train companies. And we have next this lovely, bright and colorful wooden train set made in Czechoslovakia. And again, it comes with its box. It says on the back here, made in Czechoslovakia. And this is by Tofa Trains. So it took me a bit of digging to find out, who Tofa was. And they were a company founded in the Czech Republic in the 1950s. Very well known for their brightly colored toys made from wood. Most of the toys seem to be colored in primary colors like red, green, and yellow. Red, blue, and yellow, and then there's also the addition of green. So the name means toy factory, so Tofa gets the TO from toys, and then FA from factory. And it was first founded in the 1950s, based out of the Albrecht region within the German area in northern Bohemia, but it can trace its history back to about 1908 when Johann Schoeneck began producing wooden products like beads and costume jewelry for the textile industry. They also made some toys in the 1930s under the Schoeneck name. Schoeneck perfected the art of polishing and dyeing the wood by placing them in large drums with pumice stones, which are then tilted at various angles to really polish the surface without damaging the wooden pieces. And you'll notice these are really quite smooth. They then dump them into vats of dye, where the process helped to kind of seal the surface, creating a fine, almost silk-like texture. They are then polished and varnished to make them watertight and impact resistant. In addition to this train set, they also made furniture for dollhouses, board games, and wooden blocks. During the war, the factory actually made a perfect 1:50 scale models of the Allied forces aircraft and ships in order for the Luftwaffe pilots to be able to identify and distinguish the enemy targets. And I have a suspicion that we might actually have one of those sets in our possession. Or it may or may not be. I'm not sure. It's basically a very similar set to this, made of these wooden blocks, and then you can put it together to create different kind of plane body shapes. And I was going to feature it in the plane episode, but I wasn't really sure. I couldn't trace the company. But now that I know what this is, it's easier to identify what that is. And the name is very similar. It does say Tofa as well. So it just, the label was a bit different. So this is very clear. You can see Tofa. But on the other one, it looked a bit different, so I wasn't able to find it. So anyway, moving on. They became famous for their construction sets, building blocks, beads, car planes, trains, motorcycles, and villages in the post-war period. Hans Schoeneck, the son of Johann, actually left Czechoslovakia and established his own factory in eastern Bavaria and western Germany during this time. And these post-war sets are identified by a Schoeneck logo on a shield. After the move and the formation of Tofa, they moved within Czechoslovakia to Semily and transferred management of the company here, so to Czechoslovakia in 1958, as it was easier to access. So the factory in the Albrecht region transferred over, the factory in the Albrecht region changed from toys to manufacturing upright and grand pianos, and they actually later became famous worldwide. Tofa had other factories in other parts of Czechoslovakia. They made coffins, but did not put their name on these products. And they also had other companies named. So one was Zamuski. They made abacuses, pull toys, and board games. They were also marketed under the Tumlikov, which made blackboards and cots, and Stara Paka, which made picture blocks and folding cube puzzles. They also made jigsaw puzzles and printing and packaging products. When democracy was restored to Czechoslovakia in 1989, the factories became privatized, and they became Detoa and Topa toys. So there is a little bit about, it's a wooden toy train, so it's a bit different than what we've been talking about, but I wanted to include it nonetheless. Appeal to our younger audience members, perhaps, if they care. So next we have another post-war German toy. So it comes with a box, which is lovely. It's not in the best condition, and it just says made in US Zone Germany, and we were able to identify the manufacturer based upon the logo here, which is a kind of a clover with JH written in it, and that is also repeated on the little car here as well, and it also says made in Germany US Zone. So this little car goes around and around on this track. And it was made by the Johann Hoffler Blechbahn Company, founded around 1923 by brothers Leonard, George, and Johann Hoffler. They produced tin toys and everyday objects such as buttons from sheet metal at this time. Leonard dealt with the production of metal goods, and George produced the tooling. They produced cheap goods made from sheet metal, like racing cars, interurban trains, aircraft, frogs, dollhouses, and railways. Again, their trademark was the three-leaf clover with the J and H on the inside. In 1954, the sons of Johann Hoffler took over the business and produced a series of sheet metal cars. In 1956, they began a radical change in toy production. They sold off all their metal tooling to focus solely on plastic production. And small figures like Indian cowboys and plastic cars were produced. Tucher and Waffler began to produce replicas of the J and H toys, so they likely bought some of the tooling from the company. In 1959, the logo was replaced with a globe. And in 1962, the company name, since that time, is now Big. So they created toys which are, very popular in Germany today. The logo switched over in 1966 to a buffalo, which is supposed to represent a symbol of robustness, resilience, and durability. And in 1972, the first big bobby car was presented at the Nuremberg Toy Fair, and it was 1.5 kilograms in weight, made from bright plastic pellets, and today there's been over 16 million produced, one of the best-selling children's vehicles in Europe. And in 1975, they produced the Play Big figures in order to compete with Playmobil. In 2004, they were sold to the Sima Dickey Group. So that is our made in U.S. zone little, train, interurban train on the track. So next we're going to talk about some Japanese toys. This first example here is by the Matsudaya company, and it's a friction trolley. It dates anywhere from 1928 to 1935. The trademark is TM or MT for modern toys. So initially it was founded as the Matsudaya Toy Corporation, and it was first established by Rinbi Sito in 1724 with the focus on dolls. So this company has a very, very long history. And apparently its creator was actually a descendant of Lady Saga, who was a wet nurse to the third shogun. So the company survived the end of the Edo period and the Meiji Restoration and the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, which hit Tokyo and the surrounding regions. The company temporarily suspended its operations and was evacuated during World War II. The company is actually still in operation today. So toys created between 1940 and 1960 are highly prized by collectors today. In 1955, they made one of the first radio-controlled toys. They're also really known for making Robbie the Robot from the Forbidden Planet series, which we actually have in our collection as well, though ours dates to the 1980s. And this is a tin friction toy. There's a very, very large white object inside of this train, which I believe has to do with the friction motor here at the back. So again, you would pull back on this and then it would fly. And the tin toys were produced in large numbers by the Japanese during the war, and after World War II, the Marshall Plan was designed to give Japan low-profit, high-labor manufacturing, while companies in the U.S. reaped the benefits and the profits by selling their imported products. So Japan has actually been one of the largest manufacturers of tin plate toys since the 1950s. But this piece is actually it's pre-war, and it's very kind of simple in its construction. A lot of the detail comes from the application of the lithography on the surface, and this is all one piece that's been kind of stamped out, and then the roof is added separately. So there is our electric car. It's also kind of funny if you look at it, it says children. Children, and then there's children with a little bird's nest here, and then electric car, and it says Tokyo line, so yeah, for children. Next we have this piece, which is also a friction trolley, and this is by the Yonezawa Toy Company, and it's also lithographed, but this is a post-war piece. So they were one of the largest post-war toy manufacturers in Japan. In 1991, they were actually absorbed into the Sega Corporation, which became Sega Yonezawa. So Yonezawa Toys was founded in the 1950s in Tokyo. They don't have quite the history that the other toy company did. They focused mostly on mechanical or electronic toys in the 1970s and branded sometimes as STS. And I was able to identify this because this little dove here this at the back, not the dove. So because of this trademark right here, which is a small, it's like a leaf shape with a Y in the middle. So they're very well known for producing tin plate toys with considerable accuracy and at a scale of 1 to 24 or 1 to 18. They also made die-cast toys, very popular in the 1980s. They made something called an Asahi model pet, which was a miniature pet. And they were also very popular for their robots. This is interesting because a very similar model actually appears in my research, but it was manufactured by the Haddon Company. So perhaps they were sharing their lithographed dies and prints. But it doesn't, the one from the Haddon Company doesn't have this logo, but the logo appears in almost the same spot. And this piece is quite faded, and kind of yellowed. So it's probably put on display somewhere. It is very distinctive because of these things on the top here, which you also saw in the other version. And we know that makes it a trolley car because these are actually, rather than having just a pole, they would have these, which are called pantographs. And so these are apparatus that are mounted to the roof of an electric train, trolley bus, or an electric bus, and it connects to the power from an overhead line. The diamond shape is very distinctive of the pantograph, and it was first patented in San Francisco in 1903, used on electric trains to pull trains through a tunnel. So the first use of an electrified train was actually in Baltimore, and they did this because they wanted to be able to go underwater, and they weren't able to take a steam locomotive underwater. So they came up with the idea, if we run an electric line along the roof of the tunnel, then we can pull the train through it without having to deal with the complications of the smoke and not being able to see, etc. So the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad created the first electric contact wire on the ceiling of a tunnel with a current collection device, so that's what this is. And trains could travel through this tunnel going at speeds of 30 miles per hour. It took a long time, about 25 years, before people viewed this as an economical alternative to coal-powered locomotives. And the New Haven and Pennsylvania railroads followed suit and installed their own overhead electric wires and built new electric motives as traffic in the Northeast increased. And Like I said, these are known as pantographs, and if it's just a one single wire overhead, it's known as a catenary. And this car is loosely based, I believe, on the MP54E car. E stands for electric, and that was one of the first electric multiple unit rail cars. And so they would kind of, you didn't need a locomotive necessarily, it would operate on its own. There would probably be like a driver in the car, but it was an all-in-one kind of package. And these first appeared around 1908, and they took commuters from the suburbs to the city. So there we go. It is very brightly colored and I think quite beautiful, even though it is faded. So there's that trolley car with the pantographs. So next we're going to talk about, this toy was made in Great Britain. So this is also comes with a box. So this is the Met Toy twin train tunnels, and it dates to about 1948. It was made by Met Toy Playcraft, which was founded by Philip Ullman and Arthur Katz in 1933. And they were both Jewish Germans, although Katz was also from South Africa as well. He spent some time there. So Ullman previously had a company in Nuremberg called Tip & Co., where he specialized in tin lithographed and metal wind-up toys. And he actually fled Germany around 1933 after Hitler's rise to power. And they based their operations out of Northampton and Swansea from the 1930s into the 1980s. In 1956, they became well known for their line of die-cast vehicles sold under the Corgi Toys name. That same year, they merged with the Playcraft Model Railway and Slot Car Company. In 1984, the company was sold and the assets were transferred to Corgi Toys. During World War II, the company manufactured munitions and cookware stoves for troops posted in the hot tropical locations. So this is a wind-up toy. There's a key. You wind this up and then the train spins around the track. And there's also an airplane that would actually mount to this, and that would also spin around. And it's quite beautifully lithographed, and there's also a little station, and there's a little stopping mechanism that allows you to stop the train or let it go. So there we go. Next, we're going to talk about N-scale trains. So in 1967, Aurora Plastics Corporation started importing the Minitrix N-scale product line, and they marketed these as the postage stamp trains. They were first produced in 1962 in Germany and debuted in America in 1967. These were smaller models, which were absolutely captivating to hobbyists. So N actually stands for 9 millimeters because the track is 9 millimeters. It created the ability to have a long main railroad line without sacrificing a huge amount of space. It was second in popularity only to the HO scale, and unfortunately Aurora went out of business in 1977. So this is our first example of an N-scale train set, and this was actually sold as part of a set, so we're pretty lucky to have it. You can see it pictured here. So it would have come with, the power supply and then different tracks and a locomotive as well. And what this was sold between 1969 and 1971. It is the set of freight cars known as the 4711R. So they made this set for the Santa Fe Railway. And they also made a similar set for the Great Northern Railway, the Missouri Pacific, and the Penn Central. So everything came packaged together, as you see, and this was usually in a book-like set, so it would close and then open. Or they sold larger starter sets in bigger boxes, and they were only really around for 7 years. As manufacturing processes advanced, they became increasingly popular. Locomotives, passenger cars, and track were all made by Trix in Western Germany, while freight cars were made by Roco in Australia and were branded for Trix. So, that's our first set. So we have here, there's a Great Northern boxcar and a Missouri Pacific cattle car. This is known as a gondola, so when you have the flat kind of car, you could put other larger things in it to transport it. And then there's the Penn Central caboose. And actually, it's a funny story because we got two sets together And these cars were in this box. And I was doing my research and I got very confused. And then I realized that someone had actually mixed the two up. So these were donated by somebody locally. And then I guess that when they were accessioning them in 2005, they just kind of said, okay, these look like they go in here. And so they put them in here. But the reality is they don't. So these ones are, again, N scale, but they're made by Lifelike. And I was able to kind of trace. These are all inspired by real box cars. So this one here is the Burlington Refrigerator Express. And you would be just so impressed with the work that N-scale model railroad enthusiasts have, done in terms of documenting when this car was first used in real life. Like, there's incredible amounts of detail available out there, and I just am very grateful for that, because it helps me with my research and identification of what we have. So this caboose is actually made for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe rail line. And that was one operating in the western United States. And yeah, so a bit about Lifelike. Or here, first we'll talk a bit about the Santa Fe Railway. So we also have this, which is the locomotive for the Santa Fe, but this is a diesel locomotive as opposed to many of the ones that we've already looked at, which are the steamer locomotives. So this one dates to 1975. It is Santa Fe locomotive in an N scale by Lifelike. And this was actually manufactured by Mahano. So Minitrix manufactured for postage stamp, and then Mahano, based out of Yugoslavia, manufactures for Lifelike. So it was first introduced in 1969 and was actually discontinued in the 1970s. So the Santa Fe Railway was one of the largest in the United States. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway is often just abbreviated to Santa Fe. It was first chartered in 1859, and the railroad reached the Kansas-Colorado border in 1873 and Pueblo, Colorado in 1876. It never actually surfaced Santa Fe, New Mexico, in spite of its name, as the terrain was too rough for them to reach there initially. They were a pioneer in intermodal transport, so they also had access to a tugboat fleet and an airline, although this was apparently very short-lived. When they acquired a bus line, it extended their passenger transportation service into areas that were not accessible by rail, and they also had ferry boats in San Francisco Bay, which allowed travelers to travel and complete their westward journey to the Pacific Ocean from, Santa Fe, New Mexico area. So Mahano, the company that made these, is based out of Yugoslavia, well, what is Slovenia today, and they began producing toys in 1953. They produced rolling stock and a number of locomotives and rolling stock models for Atlas and Lifelike brands. So the Lifelike imported and then sold their products starting in the 1960s and into the 70s. And they're very recognizable because they have Yugoslavia, made in Yugoslavia on the bottom. They were renamed to Mahano in 1990. Initially, it was founded as Mahano Tehnika. And so today, Izola is part of the country of Slovenia since the breakup of Yugoslavia and the end of the 1980s. The company Mahano filed for bankruptcy in 2008, but is still in operation, and Lemke actually distributes their products today. So Lifelike was a manufacturer of model trains and accessories, and they also imported and sold other companies' trains and accessories. In 1960, the company purchased the assets of the Varney scale models and began manufacturing under the name Lifelike in the 1970s. In 2005, their partner company, Life Foam, sold their model railroad operations to the hobby distributor, WMK Walthers, and they decided they didn't want to be in the train business anymore. They wanted to concentrate mostly on their foam products. that is these lifelike trains. So this refrigerator car dates from 1960 to about 1970, but it was probably sold in the 70s by Lifelike, made in the 60s. The caboose probably, made between 1970 and 1990. And then the Boston and Maine, this is the Boston and Maine boxcar, was probably, again, produced in the 1960s and then imported and sold in the 1970s. So those are some of our N-scale trains. Okay, so we've talked a lot today about American rail lines, and we haven't really talked much about Canada. We do have some other Canadian toys in our collection, but we're going to talk about this one right now. And I know it's a bit weird. It's a caboose and the locomotive. This is part of a Snaptrack train set that we have. And I just picked two of these to show you today, just because this one is almost an identical replica of the caboose that we have on the grounds here at Heritage Square. And if you're interested in learning more about that caboose, Tanis did a Heritage Live in the summertime and explaining kind of a bit of the history of the caboose and the new exhibit that is in that caboose, which you can view in the summertime months or online. So I'll try to get Miggy to put the link somewhere so that you can connect to that video. Anyway, these are made for a CP rail. So a bit about CP rail. It was first incorporated in 1891. It was part of a fulfillment made to British Columbia when it first entered Confederation. It was a transcontinental railway that would connect BC with the rest of Canada. It served a really important role in the development of the nation of Canada. And thousands of railway laborers worked on this project, including over 15,000 temporary Chinese workers. Over time, the CPR also increased communications across the country. It built hotels, shipping, and airlines, developing tourism. It also got into the mining business and other telecommunication industries in Canada. In 2001, it was split into 5 separate and independent companies, with the CPR just returning to concentrate mostly on the rail line. Today, there are over 22,500 kilometers of CPR track laid across the country and in the U.S. So in 1870, the newfound nation of Canada acquired Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company. In 1871, BC entered Confederation, based partially on the promise that Canada would construct a railway and encourage a settlement in the West. Canada decided to extinguish Aboriginal title to these lands in order to begin construction of the railway. Between 1871 and 1877, Treaties 1 to 7, which are highly contested today, attempted to establish Canadian control of lands north of the border, disregarding people that had lived on these lands for centuries. The Canadian government made all kinds of promises, both written and orally, to Indigenous peoples residing on these traditional territories. And like I said, today these are still highly contested issues that are really largely unresolved across the country. Construction was very difficult due to the hard bedrock of the Canadian Shield and other dangerous, often treacherous terrain in the Rocky Mountains. There were apparent difficulties finding laborers in BC, which led to the importation of over 15,000 Chinese laborers who were rewarded for their bravery and hard work with discrimination, meager pay, and over 600 deaths. Adding insult to injury, the Canadian government further rewarded Chinese Canadians, and I say rewarded very sarcastically, so please don't get me wrong, by implementing the Chinese Immigration Act just as soon as the CPR construction was finished. This placed a head tax on any Chinese person entering the country, and if that was not enough discrimination, they actually passed the Electoral Franchise Act, which excluded Chinese people specifically from voting. The last spike was driven in at Craigellachie in Eagle Pass on November 7th, 1885. During its construction, the CPR was involved in the sale and settlement of lands around the railway starting in 1881. They also acquired shipping company and started a line of commercial telegraph messaging. The first tourist hotels were built in places like Lake Louise, Alberta, and the first foray into the tourist industry allowed the CPR to solidify its foothold in the country and create an entire line of tourist destinations and transportation options. The first trains arrived on the West Coast in 1886. That same year, chartered sailing vessels from Japan carrying tea, silk, and other curios arrived. Chain of hotels began to expand with Hotel Vancouver, built in 1877, Chateau Frontenac in Quebec in 1893, and Place Viger in Montreal in 1898. In 1889, a line opened connecting Montreal to St. John, creating access to a port on the east coast as well. They built a line to the States in 1893, connecting Canada with North Dakota. Settlement grew rapidly after lines were built in southern Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta in 1891. Between 1899 and 1913, the CPR increased the amount of tracks it had in operation from 11,200 to 17,600 kilometers, which was laid mostly in the prairie provinces in the hopes of creating competition for the Canadian Northern Railway and the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. Between 1917 and 1923, the Canadian government formed the Canadian National Railway, an amalgamation of the Grand Trunk Railway, the Canadian Northern, the Intercolonial, and the Canadian Government Railways, in order to compete with the CPR in hotels, steamships, and other express services. Despite all of this, the CPR survived. During World War II, it provided transportation, armaments, and materials in its own shops, and 12 N vessels were pressed into service, 12 of which were lost in battle. In 2001, the company separated into 5 independent companies: the Canadian Pacific Railway, CP Ships, Pan-Canadian Energy Corporation, Fording Coal, and Canadian Pacific Hotels, which are now the Fairmont Hotels and Resorts. This allowed the CPR to return to just being a railway in 2001. So this particular locomotive is modeled after the CP 1404 diesel locomotive, which I believe might have been built in the 50s, which was known as the Canadian. I believe that this was actually made again by Mahano in the HO scale. You can read on the bottom, it took me a while to find it, but there is Yugoslavia written, like kind of embossed onto the surface of the plastic. And the caboose was actually made in Hong Kong, and I was able to find that here right on the base, the wheel base. So, or wheel truck. So these are actually HO scale, but they're from different companies. So as I said, if you want to learn more about our caboose, check out the video with Tanis. And I guess that's my time to thank you for joining us. We are nearing our station for our last stop on this exciting journey, exploring the planes, trains, and automobiles in our extensive toy collection. So keep your eye peeled for new and exciting videos exploring other items in our collection and other topics important to the heritage of Coquitlam and Canada. And thank you again, Miggy, for your patience and support during the development of these videos, and to Jesse and Nolan for their help with the collections. And I look forward to seeing you all again. Choo choo!